I've been hearing for months now that people out there keep saying that guitar is dead. Well, let's put an end to that little argument right now, shall we? If you don't follow Rob Chapman's channel on YouTube, you should. And Rob Chapman recently put up a video arguing about why guitar is not dead, and I agree with just about everything that he said. Which is what inspired me to voice my own opinion on this. So without further ado, here are 5 reasons why the guitar and the guitar industry, neither one of them, are dead. Several months back, the Washington Post posted an article about how guitar is dead. And that brought about all kinds of chatter around the internet and people speculating and and conversing back and forth whether or not there's any truth to it. More recently, there seems to be several videos that are showing up on YouTube that are all also claiming the same thing, that guitar is dead. Allow me to retort. There are 2 sides to this argument, near as I can tell anyway. The first side is the side of which we will refer to as "get off my lawn" guy. The other side of this argument we will refer to as reality. Number 1, there are no more guitar heroes. I hear "get off my lawn" guy complaining that there are no more guitar heroes to inspire young people to want to pick up the instrument. I think the reason why "get off my lawn" guy feels that way is because back in the 70s and the 80s, you had in the 60s, of course, you had the Jimi Hendrixes and the Jimmy Pages and then eventually the Eddie Van Halens of the world that just were these huge figures, and everybody knew who they were. In the 80s, Eddie Van Halen was a godsend, particularly to teenagers, and kids everywhere were flocking to music stores in droves, wanting to learn to pick up and learn to play the instrument so they could be like Eddie Van Halen. Not only that, but also just because of the state of the way that the world worked back then, those names. I did a video a while back on 6 current guitar heroes that could still be considered guitar heroes. Back then, names like Eddie Van Halen were household names. In other words, a name of a guitar player that my mother would know who he is. And my mother does know who Eddie Van Halen is. And not just because her son is a guitar player and that's how she found out about him. My mom knew who Eddie Van Halen was probably before I did. Zakk Wylde, my mom knows who Zakk Wylde is. John Mayer, my mom knows who John Mayer is. There are still those big names that are out there that are household names. And like I said, I did a whole video on this a while back, which I will link up to down in the description so you can check that out. But the reality is, because of the way that young people especially discover new music, it's not on the radio and MTV anymore. Now it's through social media and YouTube and Facebook and Twitter and all these Sirius, XM Sirius radio and and all these other avenues that just weren't around back then. And there's more guitar heroes out there than ever. You want to know who one of my favorite current, what I would call modern day guitar hero is right now? Jared Dines. He is an absolute monster guitar player and monster musician all around. And he made his name for himself on YouTube. And that's where most of his fans now go to follow him. You've got tons of guys on YouTube. You've got tons of guys that, guys and gals on YouTube. Let's not forget the Mary Spenders of the world. You've got tons of those people, real world professional musicians that practice their craft and share it with the world on YouTube, as well as all of those other avenues. And there are more than ever. We might not see them on primetime television, you know, and we might not hear them on the radio. There are more guitar heroes out there now than there ever has been before, but the media in which we experience these guitar heroes has changed. And it's in so many other places that just didn't exist back when the Eddie Van Halens of the world were running the show. The Eddie Van Halens of the world, by the way, are still very influential nowadays, even on young people. Let's not forget, every teenager out there wants to own a 5150, an EVH 5150 amplifier. Every teenager out there wants to own a Wild Audio guitar. Those guys are still as influential on the younger audience as they've always been. Number 2, guitar sales are down. The big statistic going around nowadays is that guitar sales have dropped $500 million in the last 10 years. And you know what? That is actually true. If you look at the numbers solely themselves, guitar sales are $500 million down from what they were a decade ago. But you know what number has drastically increased every single year? Guitar units sales. Guitars have become more affordable. If you look way back, once upon a time, the vast majority of people in the world couldn't afford a guitar, much less a nice one. You want to know one reason why a 59 Les Paul is as valuable as it is today? Because there were not nearly as many Les Pauls sold back in 1959 as there are today. They just weren't that common. But nowadays, you can buy a very good quality Yamaha acoustic guitar for $199. Most guitar players out there, even entry-level guitar players, do not think that $199 is that big of an investment, especially, you know, even from a beginner's level or even somebody that's a little bit more experienced. Those guitars and so many others out there are extremely well built and, again, very good quality instruments. So sales may, you know, the numbers may have dropped, but the units are going up in favor of affordability, again, to the younger generation. Number 3, large guitar companies are going bankrupt. Okay, we are all familiar with I'm not going to mention any company names here. We are all familiar with the news of the giant guitar conglomerate that recently filed bankruptcy. We've all seen the articles circulating the internet right now of a certain flagship guitar retailer, if you will, that is also reportedly having its own financial struggles. Everybody wants to talk like these companies are going out of business and we're never going to see or hear from them ever again. The guitar company that I mentioned, they filed Chapter 11 bankruptcy, not Chapter 7. Chapter 11 bankruptcy means they are restructuring their debt and restructuring basically their entire company so that they can rebuild. And that's exactly what they're doing. As far as how that's going to affect the public, other than what you read in the news, you know, the consumer the whole thing is going to be completely invisible from the consumer perspective. If the same thing happens to the retailer that I referred to, and that has not happened yet, it remains to be seen, it's going to be the exact same thing. I got some bad news for you, get off my lawn guy. They're not going anywhere, whether you like it or not. But even if they were, let's look at all of the other large guitar companies. Ibanez is doing just fine. ESP is doing just fine. Schecter is doing just fine. Martin, Taylor, Breedlove, Takamine, Washburn, Dean, Rickenbacker, PRS, Yamaha. Those new RevStar guitars are freaking awesome, by the way. They're all doing just fine. Now let's take a look at how much the popularity of some of the smaller companies has grown. You've got companies like Skirvison and Ormsby and Strandberg, Caparison, Kiesel, especially Kiesel. You know, companies like that are all producing phenomenal instruments, doing very, very well for themselves while they're at it. Then you got smaller startup companies like your Chapman guitars, your Solera guitars, that are all of a sudden blowing up all over the place too. Not to mention that just about every major city also has a handful of small luthiers that are building guitars and selling them on the side. Phenomenal instruments. And those little companies are all over the place. So when you look at the entire guitar industry as a whole, yes, we have a couple of big names that are struggling right now, but that's not going to last forever. Guitar companies are selling more guitars, building and selling more guitars than they ever have before. Retailers are selling more guitars than they ever have before. Trust me, nobody's going anywhere. Number 4. Guitar record sales are down. You know what? Five Finger Death Punch's new album dropped today. The album is entitled And Justice for None. I downloaded the deluxe version for $11.99. Oh, you know what else I did while I was at it? I also decided to download their greatest hits because iTunes also had that thing on sale for $6.99. I got 2 records for under 20 bucks. I don't remember the last being able to buy 2 CDs for under 20 bucks since the mid-90s when I was in high school. Are record sales down? Yeah, probably. And I get that there has to be a metric to be able to determine a particular song's success or a particular album's success, particularly as it relates to that artist. For the longest time, that was indeed record sales. However, again, as I mentioned earlier, people are experiencing music through so many other avenues that are not necessarily buying a record or listening to it on the radio. Those avenues are still around to some degree. But now, a particular record success is also determined by number of downloads on iTunes and number of plays on Spotify and number of plays on YouTube. Let's not forget all these big artists got pretty big YouTube channels these days. Metallica uploads a new video about every day, or every day at least, seems like. There's all these other places that fans are experiencing the music of their favorite artists through besides record sales. And there is now, instead of with YouTube, for example, it's they're not necessarily getting paid on records, on the number of views. The sales in that area may be down, but the money is not gone anywhere. It's just moved. Whereas it used to be that the money was generated through record sales. Now I can get on Metallica's YouTube channel and listen to or watch pretty much any one of their songs, for free all day long if I want to. But the money that is generated through the ad revenue that video generates is where that money has moved to. And the same is true again through through ad space on Spotify and and all these other avenues, all these other a lot of these other forms of media. So yes, while record sales may not be what they once were, reality these days seems to argue that does it really need to be? Let's not forget, these most of the bands that I listen to anyway are musicians first, but they're also business people. And if they're smart enough to keep up with the times, which again most bands nowadays are, they're going to find some other revenue streams out there to promote their careers. Misha Mansour, the guitar player for the band Periphery, is a very popular guitar player these days. There's another guitar hero, by the way. And Misha recently did an interview about how Periphery itself, they're not the biggest metal band in the world. They're not Metallica, they're not Megadeth, they're not Iron Maiden. The band itself does well enough basically to break even. So that is why Misha has been smart enough to find some other revenue streams to support his career still within our industry. He's working with Peavey now. He's working with Horizon Devices with that. They got that new metal overdrive, which is a killer pedal. Among other things. So that is how he has continued to support his career. The other thing to keep in mind is it has been a long time since any major band has really fully relied on record sales for their revenue stream. It is not cheap to produce an album, and it never has been. Most of the money that's generated from the actual sales from the record itself go to paying back the studio, the producer. You know, the producer has to earn his or her money, you know, and all the other costs that are incurred. Once an album is released, and if it does well, hopefully it does do well, then a band decides to go out on tour and tour behind it while striking while the iron is hot. So now there's more costs that are going to be involved through, and you know, that are going to be repaid through ticket sales, and that most of that money goes back to pay back the promoter and the venues, and again, you know, the other you know, the tour buses, all that kind of stuff that goes back into, you know, the additional costs that come with going out on tour. Bands, for as far back as we can remember, have been generating most of their income on merchandise sales. That is where, you know, if you ever wondered why you're paying, you know, 40 or 50 bucks for a, you know, for a t-shirt at a Poison concert, who are getting ready to go out on tour this summer, by the way, that's why. That's where their living is coming from. Most of their living is coming from merchandise sales. So, as well as some of these other revenue streams that I mentioned previously. The money is still there, it's just moved. Number 5, electronic music is taking over. I do agree with Get Off My Lawn guy to some extent on this particular point, because technology these days has advanced so far that, well, let's face it, any jerkwad with a guitar and a video camera can get himself out there nowadays. But in all seriousness, you know, the technology, particularly on the electronic music side of the industry, has advanced so far that it has made it very easy to create music for just about anybody. You know, with the right piece of equipment and a computer and pushing the right buttons, you can create music. I saw a demo recently, an in-person demo of a representative at a company demoing their new DJ controller. And this particular DJ controller is I'm not familiar with DJ controllers. This thing was pretty decent size, and it had some MIDI pads on it. And, you know, as he was building the song that he was creating, you know, he was using the MIDI pads to create a drum beat. And several times while he was creating that drum beat, me being a musician, I'm watching him, and several of those beats that he was creating were not just a little bit out of time, but they weren't even close to not being in time. The controller itself actually has the ability to compensate for that and adjust and put all of those beats that are programmed in out of time perfectly in time, and I mean perfectly in time, to where you couldn't even tell. And it keeps looping around and around and around, again, in time. Furthermore, it also has an auto-tune feature on it that he was able to auto-tune his voice and add another element to it. And these kinds of devices are out there everywhere. And again, you know, it's, you know, with a little bit of a learning curve, you know, whatever learning curve there might be involved in learning how to use an electronic device like that, can create music. Let's face it, the younger generation has always been better at learning how to use electronic devices. You know, it is a deterrent for the younger generation to want to actually learn to sit down and gut it out, and, you know, get the sore fingers and learn the memory muscle of playing chords, and, you know, all the things that beginning guitar players have to go through to learn to play the instrument, which is a long process for, you know, and longer for some people. Me, myself, it was probably 2 years, my first 2 years, I spent playing before I realized I could play some chords without thinking about where my fingers were going. It took me that long to get to that point, but I got there. And some of the technology today has allowed, again, the younger generation to avoid having to go through that. That's why they call it technology, though. But here's the thing. Eventually, musicians get bored of creating the same thing over and over again, and they want to expand and evolve. You know, while I see the electronic music argument, and as I mentioned before, I do agree with it to some extent. However, I think the argument could also be made that music and musicians are going to want to evolve, and now the MIDI controllers and the turntables and you know, the computer software and, you know, all the high-tech gear that's out on that side of the industry now is now the starting point rather than the guitar, or at least more so than it once was. So rather than the guitar being the gateway instrument, you know, now it's a MIDI controller. And as people are going to want to evolve and expand, eventually some of these other instruments are going to come in, or, you know, are going to catch the eye of some of these people. You know, deadmau5 is probably one of the most popular electronic music artists out there, and he sells out arenas and stadiums all over the world. And he's got probably 2 million lights on stage. You know, his live show is actually pretty phenomenal, and it is quite a sight to behold. Again, music, not quite my thing, not my taste, but there's a lot of production that goes into what he does. And with a lot of production, obviously, also comes a lot of work. That does not mean that he is not musically inclined at all. He actually does, in the studio, when he's writing music, he does use guitars and keyboards and lots of other actual musical instruments to write out what he is trying to create. And he incorporates that into some of the more modern technology that in his music is more in the spotlight than the guitars are. Electronic music is not taking over. It is not phasing out the guitar. The guitar just isn't the star of the show in that particular genre. Down yonder in the description below, I am going to post links to any of the videos I may have mentioned, any of the artists I may have mentioned, and maybe some links to some of the channels I may have mentioned, and anything else I may have mentioned that I can't remember off the top of my head, but will come back to me. So if it applies to this video, a link to it will be down in the description. If you enjoyed it, please consider hitting the subscribe button, and when you hit the subscribe button, there's a little bell icon right next to it. When you hit the bell icon right next to hitting the subscribe icon, or the subscribe button rather, you will get alerts of when I upload new videos every Wednesday and Saturday morning to this very channel. Please leave me a comment down below and let me know your thoughts. This has been an ongoing discussion among a lot of various different guitar groups, and now that you've heard my perspective, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Thank you so much for watching. We'll see you in the next video. You know what? There are tons of young people out there that want to get involved in music and do not have the means to do so. If you are watching this video, most likely you're a musician, and many experienced musicians have tons of broken and unwanted gear lying around that they're not doing anything with. Please visit my friends at Share the Music on Facebook at the link below and learn how you and your unwanted gear can help change somebody's life.